My son-in-law's mother looked at my work boots like they'd tracked something dead across her marble entryway. "Gerald, was it?" she said, though she'd been told my name 4 times that evening. "You really ought to invest in a proper suit if you're going to attend these functions." I smiled, said I'd take it under advisement, and reached for another shrimp. I didn't tell her that I owned the building we were standing in. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just kept smiling, kept quiet. And 3 weeks later, I made sure her son's entire financial house of cards collapsed in front of every person he'd ever tried to impress. My name is Walter Hutchins. Most people in Millbrook just call me Walt. I'm 61 years old, and for the better part of 2 decades, my happiest hours have been spent in the workshop behind my house, restoring old radios and record players, the kind nobody makes anymore. That particular evening in October, I'd been elbow deep in a 1962 tube amplifier, coaxing a stubborn capacitor back to life, when my daughter Claire called to remind me about dinner at her fiancé's family estate. I'd almost forgotten. I wiped the solder flux from my fingers, put on the one collared shirt I own that doesn't have oil stains, and drove the 40 minutes out to the Ashford estate in my 15-year-old pickup truck. Claire is 26, sharp as a tack, and the best thing that ever happened to me and my late wife, Rosalind. When Roz passed 6 years ago, it was Claire who held our family together while I fell apart quietly in that workshop, rebuilding old machines because I couldn't figure out how to rebuild myself. I owed her everything. I would have walked through fire for that girl. What I didn't know, standing in the Ashford's marble foyer that night, holding a glass of wine I didn't want, was that fire was exactly what was coming, and it wasn't going to be the kind either of us expected. Claire's fiancé is named Preston Ashford, 29 years old, work at a firm downtown called Ridgeline Capital Partners, wears watches that cost more than my truck. His parents, Douglas and Vivian Ashford, own most of the good real estate on the north side of town and never once let anyone forget it. Preston had the kind of handshake that felt like a transaction and a laugh that never quite reached his eyes. From the moment Claire brought him around, something about him sat wrong in my stomach, the way a poorly tuned engine sits wrong in your ears even before you pop the hood. But Claire loved him, and I trusted my daughter's judgment more than my own gut, so I kept my mouth shut and my opinions quieter still. What none of them knew, what Claire herself had never known, was that I wasn't just a retired repairman tinkering in a garage. Before I ever touched a soldering iron for fun, I spent 30 years building Hutchins Analytics Group from a card table in my basement into one of the largest private financial auditing firms on the East Coast. Ridgeline Capital Partners, the very firm where Preston strutted around in his tailored suits, had been a client of mine for 11 years. I still held a controlling interest in 3 separate holding companies that quietly owned pieces of half the buildings these people bragged about. Rosalind and I built that empire together with nothing but stubbornness and unpaid overtime. And when she died, the fight went out of me. I sold my active role to a trusted board, kept my shares, and went back to the version of myself I actually liked, the one who smelled like machine oil instead of boardroom coffee. Claire never knew the truth. Rosalind and I agreed early on that we wanted our daughter to grow up believing that money was earned, not inherited, not flaunted. We funded her college and her first apartment quietly, through a blind trust neither she nor anyone else could trace back to me, and we let her believe she was doing it all herself. Scholarships, grants, hard work. She was proud of that. I was proud of her for it. I never imagined that pride would someday be turned into a weapon against me. That night at the Ashford estate, over a dinner that cost more than my monthly mortgage, Douglas Ashford leaned back in his chair and asked me what exactly it was that I did for a living. I told him I fixed old radios, mostly, kept busy with my hands. He laughed, not unkindly, but in the particular way wealthy men laugh at things they've decided are beneath consideration. "Good for you," he said. "Keeps you out of trouble, I suppose," and turned back to a conversation about a Cayman property he was closing on. Preston made a comment about how it was refreshing, actually, to have someone in the family who lived a simple life, no complications, no ambition to worry about. Claire didn't defend me. She looked embarrassed. I watched my daughter's cheeks flush with something that looked a lot like shame, and it landed in my chest like a dropped wrench. 2 weeks later, Claire came by the workshop alone, without Preston, carrying a leather folder stuffed with papers. The wedding was 6 weeks out, and she needed my help sorting through vendor contracts, she said, because I was good with numbers, in my small, quiet way. I looked through the folder at my workbench, wiping grease from my hands before I touched the papers, careful not to smudge anything. The venue alone was $95,000. The florist was charging a fortune for orchids that had to be flown in from overseas. But it was the catering contract that caught my eye, specifically a rider attached to the back, a line item labeled Event Consulting and Logistics Fee, totaling $18,500, payable not to the catering company, but to an LLC I'd never heard of, registered only 2 months prior. I'd seen this pattern more times than I could count in 30 years of forensic audits. A shell company skimming money off a legitimate contract, usually because somebody on the inside needed a clean, deniable way to move cash they weren't supposed to be moving. I didn't say anything to Claire that day. Decades of auditing fraud had taught me the same lesson every single time. You never confront a discrepancy before you understand the whole picture, because the moment you do, the guilty party has time to build a story. I told her I'd look everything over and get back to her, and I spent that night on my old laptop running the LLC through every database I still had access to. The registered agent was a shell service designed specifically to obscure ownership, but buried in a filing from a neighboring state, I found a name I recognized. Preston Ashford was listed as a managing member. I sat with that information for 3 days before I did anything, because I needed to understand not just what he'd done, but how much and how far it went. Using contacts I still had from my auditing days, quiet, discreet, thorough people, I had a look into Ridgeline Capital Partners' internal accounts. What I found wasn't a young man skimming a little money off a wedding contract for pocket cash. It was a pattern going back 14 months. Preston had been diverting client funds through a network of shell companies, small amounts individually, but the total came to just over $340,000. He wasn't paying for flowers with stolen money. He was drowning, and the wedding fee was the smallest tip of a very large iceberg. I could have called Claire that night and told her everything. Some nights since, I've wondered if I should have, but I kept picturing her face if I told her the man she loved was a thief, with nothing but my word and a stack of documents to back it up, and I knew she wouldn't believe me. Not yet, not while she still saw him as her golden ticket into a world she thought I'd never understand. So I did the only thing 30 years in this business ever taught me actually works. I waited, I watched, and I let the trap build itself. Claire showed up at my workshop again that Friday, this time upset, mascara smudged, saying Vivian Ashford had informed her that the guest count had grown to 240 people, and there was now a shortfall of $60,000 that needed to be covered before the final vendor deadline on Monday. She asked me, her voice tight with an embarrassment she couldn't quite hide, if there was any way I could help. I told her gently that I didn't have that kind of money lying around, that I was a retired repairman living on a modest pension. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's disappointed you, and said, quietly, that she supposed she'd figured as much. Then she said something I don't think she meant to say out loud. I just wish, for once, you were the kind of father who could actually show up when it mattered. She left without hugging me. I stood in my driveway and watched her taillights disappear, and something in my chest went cold and still, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. I wasn't angry at Claire for not knowing about the money. I was angry, deeply and quietly angry, at watching my daughter absorb the idea that love and money were the same currency, that showing up meant writing a check. Rosalind and I raised her better than that, or so we thought. Somewhere in Preston's world of tailored suits and casual cruelty, she'd started measuring her own father by a ruler that was never built for people like me. And worse, she'd started measuring herself by it too. 4 days before the wedding, Preston showed up at my workshop unannounced. His hair uncharacteristically messy, dark circles under his eyes, a leather folder shaking slightly in his hand. He said he needed to talk to me man to man. I set down the tube amplifier I'd been working on and wiped my hands on a rag, waiting. He told me the wedding was in jeopardy, that a banking error had frozen some of his accounts. Temporary, he assured me. Nothing serious, but he needed $60,000 by Monday morning or the venue would cancel everything. He said he knew I didn't have liquid cash, but I owned my house outright and a home equity loan could be approved in 48 hours if we moved fast. He'd already spoken to a loan officer. All I had to do was sign. I looked at him for a long moment, and I thought about the 14 months of stolen client money sitting in my files at home, the felony wire fraud charges just waiting to be filed, the woman who'd have to live through her husband's public unraveling. I told him, calmly, that I wasn't going to mortgage my home for a wedding. His face changed instantly, the practiced charm sliding off like wet paint. He called me pathetic. He said Claire deserved a father who could actually provide for her, instead of hiding in a garage full of broken junk. He said I'd always be an embarrassment to her, and that once they were married, he intended to make sure she saw as little of me as possible so she could finally live the kind of life she deserved, a life I clearly couldn't give her. He stood in my driveway, shaking with a rage that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the walls closing in around him, and told me I was going to die alone in that garage and nobody was going to care. I didn't raise my voice. I told him, quietly, that he was probably right, that I was just a simple man who fixed old radios, and I wished him luck with his banking troubles. He didn't understand why I wasn't afraid. He couldn't have known that the loan officer he'd spoken to worked for a bank where I sat on the board. He couldn't have known that the moment he walked away from my driveway, I picked up the phone and made one call to a forensic accountant I'd trusted for 20 years and told her it was time to finish the audit and take it to the authorities. The wedding day arrived on a bright, cold Saturday. I sat that morning with a legal folder on my kitchen table, prepared by lawyers who'd worked for me for 2 decades, containing the complete and fully documented evidence of Preston Ashford's embezzlement from Ridgeline Capital Partners, cross-referenced with federal wire fraud statutes. I put on the one good suit I own, a charcoal gray one I'd worn to Rosalind's funeral and nowhere since, and I drove out to the country club where 240 guests were gathering to celebrate a marriage built on borrowed time and stolen money. I want to tell you honestly that I didn't walk in wanting to destroy my daughter's wedding day. I walked in because I loved her too much to let her marry a man on the verge of federal prison without at least trying to stop it quietly beforehand, and because some debts, once you understand their true size, can't be paid off with silence anymore. The ballroom was full of white orchids and candlelight when I stepped through the doors. The string quartet faltered as 240 heads turned to look at the man in the plain gray suit walking down the center aisle. Vivian Ashford's mouth opened as if to say something cutting, but nothing came out. Claire, standing at the altar in her mother's veil, the only thing of Rosalind's she'd insisted on wearing, saw me, and her face went through confusion, then anger, then something that looked almost like fear. I didn't stop at the altar to make a scene for its own sake. I walked straight to Preston, who had gone the color of old paper the moment he saw the folder in my hand, and I set it down gently in front of him on the small table meant for the guest book. I told him, in a voice that didn't need to be raised because the room had already gone completely silent, that the Federal Wire Fraud Division had been notified that morning that the shell companies tracing back to his name were now the subject of an active investigation, and that the frozen accounts he'd been so worried about weren't a banking error at all. They'd been frozen by court order. Douglas Ashford stood up so fast his chair clattered backward, demanding to know who I thought I was, threatening to have security remove me. I looked at him, and for the first time all evening, I let myself smile, just slightly. I told him my name was Walter Hutchins, founder and majority shareholder of Hutchins Analytics Group, and that his son's firm, Ridgeline Capital Partners, had been one of my clients for over a decade. I told him the men his son had been stealing from for the past 14 months were, in fact, several of the very people sitting in that ballroom that afternoon, applauding a marriage that was never going to happen. The police arrived 11 minutes later. I know because I watched the clock the entire time, the way you watch a clock during a surgery, waiting to know if the thing you set in motion was actually going to heal something or just cause more damage. They led Preston out of the ballroom in handcuffs, past 240 guests who had, moments earlier, been raising champagne glasses in his honor. Vivian Ashford sobbed into her husband's shoulder. Douglas Ashford, for the first time since I'd met him, had absolutely nothing to say. Claire found me in the parking lot afterward, still in her wedding dress, mascara streaked down both cheeks, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold her phone. She asked me how I could do this to her. Today, of all days, in front of everyone she knew, I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I hadn't done this to her. Preston had done this to himself over 14 months, one shell company at a time, and I had simply made sure the truth arrived before she signed a marriage certificate, binding her legally to a man who was about to spend the next several years in a federal courtroom. She asked, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from her since she was a little girl, why I never told her who I really was, why I let her believe her father was just a man who fixed old radios in a garage. I told her the truth. I told her that her mother and I wanted her to know the value of things earned honestly before she ever learned the weight of things inherited, and that somewhere along the way, without either of us noticing, she'd started believing that a person's worth could be measured by the size of their bank account. And that particular lesson was one neither Rosalind nor I had ever wanted to teach her. She didn't speak to me for 3 weeks after that. I won't pretend that silence didn't hurt. There were nights I sat alone in my workshop, holding one of Rosalind's old photographs, wondering if I'd made the right call or simply the easiest one to justify to myself. But I never once regretted stopping her from marrying a man who would have eventually done to her exactly what he'd done to his own clients, and to me in that driveway the week before. Preston Ashford was formally charged 3 weeks later with wire fraud and embezzlement. The total loss is eventually calculated at just over $340,000. He pled guilty rather than face trial and was sentenced to 4 years in a federal facility. Douglas and Vivian Ashford quietly sold their Northside properties within the year, and I heard, through channels I still maintain, that their marriage did not survive the scandal either. I don't take pleasure in that. I never wanted their ruin. I only ever wanted my daughter safe. Claire called me on a Tuesday evening in early spring, 5 months after the wedding that never happened. Her voice was different, steadier, quieter, the voice of someone who'd spent a long winter thinking hard about things she used to take for granted. She asked if she could come by the workshop. I told her the door was always open. It always had been. She just never needed to knock before. She sat with me for hours that evening, asking questions she'd never thought to ask before, about the company, about her mother, about the version of my life she'd never known existed because Rosalind and I had worked so hard to hide it from her, out of love, out of a belief that we were protecting something important in her. She cried when I showed her the original ledger from the basement card table where Hutchins Analytics Group had started 41 years ago, with nothing but her mother's determination and my stubbornness. She told me she was sorry, not just for the wedding, not just for the things she'd said in anger, but for 6 years of quietly believing that the size of a man's bank account said anything at all about the size of his heart. I forgave her. Not because she asked for it in exactly the right words, but because I understood, watching her sit there in my cluttered little workshop surrounded by 40 years of broken machines I'd lovingly put back together, that some people have to lose everything they thought they wanted before they can see clearly what they actually had all along. These days, Claire works 2 mornings a week at a nonprofit financial literacy program I quietly fund through the Rosalind Hutchins Foundation, teaching young people the difference between wealth and worth, a distinction it took her a devastating wedding day to finally learn. She still lives modestly in a small apartment across town, paying her own rent with her own income. And she tells me now, whenever she visits, that it's the first time in her adult life she's ever felt genuinely proud of herself. I still spend my mornings in the workshop, restoring old radios that everyone else has given up on, coaxing life back into machines that still have music left in them, if somebody's just willing to take the time. I never did trade in my old pickup truck. I never wanted a life bigger than the one Rosalind and I actually built together, quietly, one honest day at a time. The greatest lesson I carry from all of this isn't about Preston, or the money, or the 14 months of fraud that nearly cost my daughter her future. It's this: love your children enough to let them struggle sometimes, enough to let the truth arrive on its own schedule, instead of rescuing them from every hard lesson life is trying to teach. Real love isn't a blank check. It's the courage to let someone fall exactly far enough to learn how to stand back up on their own, and the patience to be standing there quietly in the workshop when they finally do.